Now we're going to shift focus over to data access, and we'll start with just an overview of data access. And this is a critical function of an IT professional. We have to ensure that users are able to get to the data that they need in order to perform their job. And that's because lack of access is going to result in limited productivity. If I can't get to the files that I need, then I can't do my job. If I'm getting errors, if access is denied, or for some other reason the data is unavailable, that's going to have a direct effect on me. But on the other side of things, unauthorized access to resources is going to result in security breaches. So we need to make sure that the individuals can get access to the data that they need, but that it's only the appropriate individuals and only the appropriate data. And especially in business environments, that's going to vary from case to case. There are pieces of data that should be accessible by all, like company forms or a calendar, a schedule, things like that. But then there are other pieces of data that would be secured. In some cases, we're talking about security so that only a single authorized user can access data. In other cases, it might be a group or a division or a particular location that has access to that data. And the access to the data needs to be controlled not only for who is accessing it, but the level of access that they're going to have. So there are two processes that allow us to do this, and we really need to start here just by understanding these two processes. Those are called authentication and authorization, and they're foundational to network security. They're utilized by Windows 10 as well as other systems to control access to resources. So authentication is first. It has to be first because authentication is validating the identity of an individual or system. Authentication can use multiple methods. It could be a username and a password. It could be biometrics. It could be a PIN number. We call these the authentication factors, and technically there are three of them. Single factor authentication just uses one of them, okay? Hence the name. So the most common type of authentication is what you know. Essentially, if you know the appropriate username and password combination for a particular identity, a user in the database, this local security database or domain database, then you can log in. You have validated your identity through your knowledge of a username and password combination. You could probably see how that's not foolproof. I mean, if somebody has a username and a real weak password, or the password that's the name of one of their children, then it would be possible for someone else to guess that information and to log onto the system, validating, quote unquote, their identity as this other person. So it's not foolproof, and in higher security scenarios, that's where we start getting multi-factor authentication. If not multi-factor, at least changing which factor we're going to use. So the what you have factor is requiring you to have something in order to authenticate. And that something usually in a Windows environment is a smart card. A smart card is a credit card sized device. It's got a little cryptographic chip in it, and that cryptographic chip can store a digital certificate. So it serves as a digital form of identification. Generally speaking, I would have to insert the smart card into the keyboard or a separate smart card reader, and then I would have to provide a PIN number. Okay? So usually it's multi-factor authentication. This is what I have this, but I also know something. That might not always be the case. The third potential factor would be biometrics. It's who you are. Of course, that's the most secure because it's the most difficult to fake. You know, if I'm using iris scanners, retina scanners, fingerprints, facial recognition, any of those types of things can greatly extend or enhance your authentication mechanisms. Then you have authorization. Authentication has to come first. I have to know who you are, but just because you are who you say you are doesn't mean you can do whatever it is you're trying to do. I've made that statement many, many times. We know that, okay? Just because you walk up, say, to a party and there's a VIP list and it's a party, a dinner that you're trying to get into, but you have to be on the list. Okay, so just because I walk up and show my ID and say that my name's Patrick Lohner doesn't mean I'm actually going to get in. No, my name has to be on the list that grants access. And so the same thing is going to occur in a Windows environment. You must have a valid identity. I must be able to tell who you are, but then the process of authorization is making sure that you are in fact able based on our policies and permissions, to do whatever it is you're trying to do, to open a folder, to access a network drive, to run an application, those kinds of things. And authorization in Windows is done using what's called an access control list. Simply a list. These are the identities that are able to access this file or folder, and then here are the permissions that they have. So these are two integral, foundational concepts that we've got to understand. The other key concept is permissions. And so when we talk about permissions, we're talking about the permission to do something, the permission to perform a particular action, and it's a permission that is assigned to a specific user on a specific object. Permissions do not grant rights throughout the entire domain. Okay, permissions are on a particular object, like a folder or a drive or a particular file. And so they're granted on a resource by resource basis. The access control list contains the permissions. The permissions can be allowed or denied. So I can say you are able to do this, or I want to make sure that you aren't able to do that. And so, in so doing, they control the level of access as well. So not just can you or can't you, but what can you do? All of that is controlled via permissions. Now, in domain environments, you've got Active Directory, domain services, users, and groups that are used on the access control list. In home and small business environments, we're talking about local user accounts or home groups. It's really all about where the account is actually stored. If you're in a domain environment, then the account is stored in the domain database, and permissions can be granted to that account across domain resources. So on a file server, on a web server, on an email server, in SharePoint, they can be granted anywhere within the domain. When you're dealing with local accounts, permissions can be granted anywhere within that sphere, that domain, only that sphere or domain is just one computer. So you don't, I hesitate to use the word domain just because I don't want to confuse, but the local user accounts can be granted permissions on the local computer. The domain user accounts and groups can be granted permissions on any domain computers. And so that's why in business environments, we're typically going to see the domain being used. There are essentially three different network models. If you take a Network Plus course, they'll talk about two network models. And so the third here is kind of a Windows-only hybrid called the home group. But essentially the two network models are work group or a domain. It's one or the other in the vast majority of environments. And a work group is a collection of systems. They've collected them together, given them the same work group name, and it's for the purpose of sharing resources. We set up local accounts for each individual on their computer. That allows us to give them access to resources on their computer. If we needed them to have access to other computers, we would have to create accounts on those additional computers. Okay, if I'm on PC 1 and I have an account there and I go try to access something on PC 2, my account on the original PC is going to be meaningless because it's a totally different security database that stores the users and groups. So you generally would duplicate accounts across multiple machines, or the alternative to that would be you set up some form of shared account. Now, clearly in a workgroup environment, security is not a huge issue, but sharing accounts is not a great idea because it doesn't give me the ability to track access on a per user basis. In a workgroup scenario, we definitely have decentralized administration and security. Everything has to be handled at each individual computer, and so typically work groups are kept to about 10 computers or less in general. A domain is a collection of systems, but it's a collection of systems that have a common security database. That database is referred to as the domain database, and it's stored on domain controllers. So when you log into a domain, you're logging into this collection of systems, and you're able to use the same account to access resources across multiple computers, assuming that you're authorized. So with the domain, we have centralized administration and security. Of course, we have the need for actual administrators at that point. We have the need for servers that are functioning as domain controllers and DNS servers. We have a lot more. There's a lot more to do in a domain environment, but the vast majority of your businesses are going to be domain environments. Now, a home group is not really a separate network model. It's actually a hybrid form of a work group that was introduced in Windows 7. It is a collection of systems but it's a collection of systems for which we've greatly simplified the control of the systems and the access. You've given yourself some form of centralized control, okay, in the fact that you've created a home group on one machine, you've joined the home group from other machines, and it handles the authentication process for you. So PC1, PC2, if they both belong to the same home group, then a user on PC2 can access resources on PC1 without actually having a user account. Okay? Now behind the scenes, that's because there's a home group user that's actually being used, but that's why I say it's a form of hybrid. It's still work group, it's still decentralized, but there's an account that gets created automatically as a part of the home group creation. So therefore, home groups offer an easy way to configure accounts and sharing, and they're very useful in small networks, obviously home networks. A home group is configured via the Network and Sharing Center in Windows 10, and it alleviates that problem of having to have multiple accounts on each individual computer. When you create a home group, you're going to specify exactly what it is you want to share, and you have the option to share documents, pictures, videos, music, and printers. And we can go in and we can configure all of those settings via the Network and Sharing Center. Now you might wonder, well, why is this that important? This is not going to be used in a business environment. And albeit that is the case, this is actually one of the things listed on the objectives of this exam. And so you are going to encounter people running Windows 10 in small business environments with no domain, with home environments, and we need to know how to configure the home group. So let's take a look at those settings. We'll get into the Network and Sharing Center here. Okay, this machine is not a member of the domain. We'll just validate that. I am a member of a work group. Okay? I'm running enterprise, which would not be common, but that doesn't matter. The home group capability is there on all of the systems. So get back into the Network and Sharing Center. And in the Network and Sharing Center, we've got this area, this link to home group. Okay? So we click on home group, and then we would have the option. Now it says, you can't do this because your network location needs to be set to private. We're going to say yes. Okay, so I just needed to switch. My network location was set to public, and that we've seen that a couple times. There's some things that you can't do in public. You've got to be connected, in this case, to a private network. So now we're ready to create a home group. We'll hit next. Okay, notice everything's shared except for documents, and these are libraries that are shared. A library is like a virtual folder location. It was introduced in Windows 7. We'll go into that here in a little bit. If you want to share your documents, go ahead and share them. Hit next. It creates a password. You can print that. You can hit finish, and then at that point, this will refresh here in a second. There we go. And you can change the password if you want, just to change it to something a little bit easier to remember. It's not like we're in high security environments, so not a huge deal. You can click on Advanced Sharing Settings. There's a lot here, and there is a setting for home groups. However, it's set to what it should be, and that's allow Windows to manage the home group connections, as opposed to use user accounts and passwords to connect to other computers. Well, that's just going back to the old work group way of doing things. So we don't want to do that. We want the home group to handle it, okay? And so let me show you here, computer management. When you go into computer management, local users and groups, you've got a home group user, and this is a built-in account for home group access. So when somebody from another PC tries to access my PC, they're actually using that account, so it alleviates the whole account issue. Okay, now that the home group has been created over in Windows Explorer, or File Explorer, excuse me, now we've got a home group that's going to show up. My name, and then my desktop, and then any, of the libraries that I'm sharing. Other systems are going to show up here as well that belong to the home group. Okay? As I said, these are going to be libraries, and if you want to include additional folders in a library, then you can do that. Okay? So I can go and say, I'm going to right-click this, and I want to include this in the Documents library. And so, as I said, the library is like a virtual folder location. If you want to share things in a home group, you don't need to share the individual files or folders. You just simply include them in one of the libraries. it's virtual because it didn't change the physical location of that folder. It just made it so that it was going to be shared. Okay? And so I got a little pop-up that says, you sure you want to share this? Yes, I want to change settings. I'm going to share all of those things. All right? So that's the concept of the home group, and it really is very beneficial in small environments. It makes it a lot easier for us to share data between computers.